We now get to our sleepless insider, Frank Seravalli. 59 days until the deadline. Frank, maybe we should just call this like nap time or something. You can do like 2 answers, and then we'll leave you alone. You can take like a 15-minute nap every Wednesday.
Yeah, I don't think that's going to work. I'm a big nap guy, though, big proponent and fan of naps, but I don't think we're getting much sleep during this deadline.
Some Oilers fans didn't get a lot of sleep last night, Frank. They are pissed off. They are in the comment section saying, "You're overplaying Stuart Skinner. Look what you've done. Ken Holland's incapable of fixing this team. They lack character. There's problems in the room. They blew that game to Seattle last night, and the fire alarms are going off." Do you have anything that can calm down this Oilers fan base, or do they have legitimate reason to be a little irked after what they saw last night?
No, I think there's legitimate reason to be upset with this entire season and the way that it's played out to this point. And there's no revisionist history on my part. Tyler, what did I say right from Jump Street when the season started? I have serious concerns about Jack Campbell and this team's goaltending.
Yep.
Obviously, Skinner is in net last night. He's the guy that ends up getting pulled. His numbers have kind of come back to earth a little bit. I don't think he's the reason to blame or anything like that. But you also have a situation in that game when there's a timeout called, and not only do things not change for the Oilers, they get worse. So whatever message is being sent isn't being delivered. I think that was a question mark coming out of the game on Tuesday night. And I also think this team needs help. It can't all be the focus of, hey, let's just get Evander Kane back and we're going to be set to go for the deadline. This team needs help on the back end. And I think they're actively working to try and fix that. But, I think there's probably been it's fair to say, a bit of complacency that's existed, that they need to jumpstart this season and ensure that this team not only gets into the playoffs, but is able to do some damage.
Complacency is an interesting word. There's also a lot of people wondering, do they miss the veteran leaders that they no longer have? Duncan Keith isn't here anymore. Mike Smith, say what you want about him. He gave them good results, and he was a fiery competitor. And maybe that's something they look to address at the deadline as well. That's why a guy like Jonathan Toews is high on my list of dream trade targets for the Oilers, because I think they could use someone who comes in there and gives them a bit of an experience. And it's crazy that we have to say that at this point when Connor McDavid and Leon Draisaitl are in their 8th and 9th seasons or whatever. But maybe the Oilers do miss a little bit of veteran leadership.
No, I think that's a really fair point, and I think it's something that the Oilers probably overlooked a bit. I think that's one reason why, Taves is probably on their list somewhere. I think at this point there's more of a focus and emphasis on defense right now, and finding a defender that works and can make a pass and can withstand the forecheck. But I do think it was probably understated, the impact that Duncan Keith had on this team. Everyone ripped the Oilers for that trade when it went down, but I think you saw his impact when you got to the playoffs last year. He handled everything well, and I think he was a sort of steadying, calming influence for this team. And Smith, you mentioned the fiery aspect that he brought. Those two things I think have really been missing at times this year. And maybe it's fair to ask the question, as you did, as to whether this team should need those components given the experience that they have in the league already and the highs and lows that McDavid and Draisaitl have experienced together. And some other veteran guys that have been around for a bit, and a Tyson Barrie and Darnell Nurse has been around long enough to understand some of those things. But the fact of the matter is, it doesn't matter what they are missing. They need to go replace it. It's not about, looking backwards. It's about looking forward. And so can you find someone that checks some of those boxes? Does maybe a Joel Edmondson type, with his, not just his game, but his Stanley Cup pedigree, having been through it and won in St. Louis, does that matter? Is that one of those things that you try and look for as you get to checking off some of those boxes for the Oilers?
Joel Edmondson not in your top 10. I got a couple of questions about your new trade targets list that is up at dailyfaceoff.com, but I want to focus in the top 5. Patrick Kane and Jonathan Toews. I think a lot of fans outside of Chicago sit here and go, it's a lock that both these guys are getting moved in the next 2 months. Is that necessarily the case, though?
It's a possibility for sure that both players are moved. I would say at this point, this exact moment in time, January 4th, 2023, that it's more likely that Taves is on the move than Kane. But I still think Kane is a 50-50 shot. So if you're reading between the lines, that means that Taves is better than that or higher than that to go. I think there's been some real frustration with Taves not just in terms of where the franchise is heading, but also in game. You can see it. The frustration is evident when he comes back to the bench. I'm sure after what he was accustomed to in the first 8 years that he spent with the Blackhawks, that the way these last 5 or so have gone has been really disappointing, and that he might be open to more opportunities than Patrick Kane. Patrick Kane feels like it's going to be a curated selection, a place that has a chance to win, like Taves, but also has some really talented players to play with, and that he could potentially sign with longer term. So, be real curious to see as these players hold the cards, how many options, if any, are presented. And I just think with Kane, who has been a better player than Taves, no doubt, not just this year, but the last few, there's a lot of ties to Chicago, and it's not just the winning. It's also, his family has moved to Chicago and set up home base there from Buffalo. His dad's at morning skates and practices, and he goes to a lot of road games. And you look at that, and his the mother of his child is there, like his girlfriend, like all those things. That kind of factors in and weighs in a way that I don't think Taves necessarily has as much baggage. So I'd be real curious. Flip a coin on Patrick Kane. Or you can call him Patrick Coin if you want.
Why not? Going from numbers 6 through 10 on the list, we see 4 defensemen, but the one I want to zero in on is Mathias Ekholm. I remember, I think it was the first time the Oilers played the Preds this year, and I had some people in the chat on YouTube being like, "Oh, Ekholm would be a dream fit for the Oilers," and I was like, "You're insane. He's in year 1 of a $6.25 million extension that goes for 4 seasons. Like, they're not moving this guy." Yet here he is on your list. So explain why this guy could potentially even be available in year 1 of an extension.
Well, it's gotten late early for the Preds, who have regressed in a significant way. And I think a bunch of people saw that coming. But now they have to ask themselves some really complicated and difficult and uncomfortable questions as they're well outside the playoff picture. And even if they get in, is anyone looking at that team as one that could go the distance and be a contender? I think the answer pretty resoundly is no. And then you start to look at their back end after acquiring Ryan McDonough last summer with Ekholm and Roman Yossi. That's 3 guys essentially making $6.5 million or more. Is that sustainable moving forward? And if not, well, Ekholm is the guy that stands out to me as someone with no trade protection there, that he could be moved to any team at any time. And so I think there is some interest in Ekholm. I think the cap hit is probably a bit much with the term that's remaining on it, 3 years after this one, as you mentioned, that I think probably suppresses a little bit of the return. But I think if the Preds are willing to retain a bit, that you would see a number of teams step up and be willing and interested to take on someone like Ekholm. And I think the big thing is stylistically, I think, probably an ideal fit for the Oilers in terms of what they'd be looking for. My question is, can you really afford to keep him on the cap? That's the wrangling that the Oilers would have to do. And I just don't know if they'd be able to pull something like that off.
Yeah, and just for me, the tough part acquiring any D-man with term is you have a tougher time getting the other side to retain it. Like to enable to afford. Oh boy, now I'm the one fumbling my words, Frank. But if they wanted to afford Ekholm, they would probably need the Preds to keep half for this year. But the Preds probably don't want to keep half that contract for the next 3 seasons as well. And it's almost the same thing with Edmondson, where yeah, okay, you could dump Puljujarvi out, but Edmondson's still 3.5. Would the Canadians want to keep a chunk of that money for next season as well? I feel like because of their cap, how tight they are to the cap, the Oilers' only option is rentals at the deadline.
Yeah, I don't think it's their only option. I just think they'd have to get creative in terms of some of the pieces that they move. Like you said, moving Puljujarvi in any trade going backwards. Let's say, let's just play hypothetical here, since he was publicly linked to the Oilers. I think his no trade clause might get in the way. But Jake McCabe from the Chicago Blackhawks, if you were to send Puljujarvi back there, well, you still have more years of Jake McCabe remaining at $4 million. I don't think many teams want to retain on guys with term, because it's not just a retained salary transaction that gets chewed up. It's also part of your cap moving forward. So there's a significant price to pay for that. All of that, which says, I don't know, the Oilers would have to get pretty creative in order to make something like that happen. And I don't know, not that I don't see it, but there's only very few paths to make that happen.
Last area I want to hit on with you. You have a new piece up today at dailyfaceoff.com about where kind of every team in the Eastern Conference stands, what they could look to add, or which teams could be sellers. And one team I'm just fascinated by is the Florida Panthers. What's the latest with the Panthers, and what could it look like if they do indeed decide to sell ahead of the March 3rd deadline?
Well, the Panthers are in a tough spot, Tyler. 13th place. They don't have a first round draft pick until 2026. And they have $14.5 million committed to their goaltending next season. So they're in a spot where I think their top objective at this deadline is to set the table for the summer. They're going to have 12 million bucks coming off the books and Patrick Hornquist's deal expiring and some dead cap money that goes by the wayside. So they've took a step back this year, and I think they expected that. Definitely not this much to go from a 122-point team down to being on pace for somewhere around 78 or 80 points. That's a 42 or 44-point cliff that they've fallen off of and died on impact, essentially, if you want to quote Billy Madison or Happy Gilmore. I think it was Happy Gilmore. But, you look at this moving forward and you say, they need some off-season surgery. So to create some flexibility to then be in a spot where you not just have cap space, but you maybe have some future assets that you can trade to rebalance your team and maybe take a forward, trade them at the deadline, get some assets and leverage those assets in the summer to go after a defenseman. Well, I would look at a couple guys further up their depth chart that have been really good ads for them, and Sam Reinhart and Sam Bennett, the two Sams. I think there would certainly be a lot of interest in those players given their talent and their skill sets, that perhaps Bill Zito can sort of play this out in a way that he's able to have maximum leverage in the summer to get what he needs to put the Panthers back in playoff contention.
You want to talk about the Oilers wanting pieces that can maybe add some bite to their middle six, adding a centerman. Sam Bennett he'd be a really intriguing option for Edmonton. And on the blue line, what about a guy like Radko Gudas? I mean, $2.5 million pending UFA. Like, I just look at the Panthers and Gudas and Bennett, and I'm like, it's a couple of guys who would scratch the itch for the Oilers.
Yeah, I mean, scratch the itch in terms of adding some edge and bite, but I don't know if you're the Oilers and you're going on a deep playoff run to the Western Conference Final again, whether you'd like to be giving Radko Gudas any more than 12 minutes a night or 14 minutes a night. So it would come at a cost in the sense of you'd really need to ration out those minutes and limit them, because that's one thing the Panthers fell into is Gudas was playing probably more than he should and needed to be properly slotted out in the third pair.